I'm going to be like the cowboy preacher, who went out to preach and only one cowboy showed up. And he preached for an hour and a half. And the cowboy said, man, that was a long sermon. And he said, well, if you go out to feed the cattle and only one cow shows up, you feed him, don't you? And he said, yeah, but I don't dump the whole load of hay on him. Job, chapter 39. We're going to start in chapter 39. We're going to end up with the first verse of chapter 40 tonight. Very, very interesting. Do y'all remember here a while back on television, there was a thing that, it was on the news shows, and it ran for weeks, about April the giraffe. Yes. Y'all remember that? Yes. April the giraffe was about to give birth. Does anybody remember what the gestation period was for? Forever. Huh? 140 weeks. I don't know. It was a long time, though. We kept watching April, and April was pregnant forever, and she just did not seem to want to drop that baby. Well, actually, we're going to find out tonight that God is involved in that sort of thing. In this chapter, God continues to pepper Job with all kinds of questions. Matter of fact, he asked Job, all told, 77 questions. That's not a pop quiz, is it? That's a full-blown quiz right there. It's not an easy one. And he'd been asking Job about creation. Were you here when the sun, the moon, the stars, the lightning, and all of the snow and all this stuff? Were you here about the oceans, and did you establish their boundaries and all this kind of stuff? Well, he changes just a little bit now, and he begins to talk about animals. And he talks about, we talk about animals that have instinct. They do things by instinct. Anybody ever stop and think where the instinct came from? It was inborn. It was something that was born in them. I was watching Mountain Men last night, and one of the guys is a falconer. And he had caught a falcon about 10 years ago and trained it to hunt. And for 10 years, he had taken that falcon out to hunt and everything. And he said, all right, we've reached the time where I need to release this falcon. And he said, what I'm going to do is take her back to the place where I trapped her to begin with. And I'm going to release her there. And pretty soon, there are other hawks and everything in the area. And they will begin to migrate. And she will pick up on that. And she will migrate as well. And she'll be re-entered into the wild population, and that's what he did. He took the falcon up there, and he took the little, they have a little hood that they put on them before they get loose, and he took the little hood off and gave her some food and everything, and then she ate that food that he had on his glove, and then she started looking around, and he said she's just about ready to go, and pretty soon she took off. And she circled over them 2 or 3 times. And then she sort of took off and everything because instinct told her, this is where I belong. And she was able to be put back in the animal kingdom, the bird kingdom, if you will, and go back to her own kind. That doesn't happen by accident. Let's look at what God says in chapter 39. Do you know when mountain goats give birth? Have you ever watched the deer in labor? Can you count the months they are pregnant so that you can know the time they give birth? They crouch down to give birth to their young. They deliver their newborn. Their offspring are healthy and grow up in the open field. They leave and do not return. And he said, Job, do you know anything about this? Do you know how this happens? Who set the wild donkey free? Who released the swift donkey from its harness? I made the desert its home and the salty wasteland its dwelling. It scoffs at the noise of the village and never hears the shouts of a driver. It roams the mountains for its pasture land, searching for anything green. Would the wild ox be willing to serve you? Would it spend the night by your feeding trough? Can you hold a wild ox to a furrow by its harness? Will it plow the valleys behind you? Can you depend on it because its strength is great? Would you leave it to do your hard work? Can you trust the wild ox to harvest your grain and bring it to your threshing floor? All of these questions God is asking not because he expects Job to know the answer, but he wants Job to recognize that divine knowledge was involved in all of these things and that God created these things. Now, we have a hard time equating to something like that. The closest thing we can come to a wild ox would be a bison or buffalo or perhaps a water buffalo. They told me when I was in South Africa that the most dangerous animal in the jungle was a water buffalo. Now, who'd have thunk it? I would have thought any. Matter of fact, our guide, who I think made up stories just to freak us out, he was British background, and it worked for Evangelism Explosion in South Africa. And he told us this one story that just was unreal. He said there's this group of people who were going on a photography safari through Kruger National Game Preserve, which happens to be where we were at the time he was telling the story. And they got out, and they're not supposed to get out of their combis. They call them combis. They're vans, actually, Volkswagen vans, but they call them combis. And they're not supposed to get out of their combis. They're supposed to do everything from the windows. But they got out and thought they were going to take pictures. Well, a water buffalo can run about 45 miles an hour. And once they get going, they can really go. Well, a water buffalo charged them, and one guy ran up a tree. And he was hanging onto that tree. And here's the story he told. He said, the water buffalo has a very rough tongue, kind of like a cat's tongue in a way. It's kind of rough, not really smooth. And said that boy had on sandals, and they fell off as he climbed up that tree. And so that water buffalo reared up on the tree and licked his feet, the bottom of his feet, until they began to bleed. And the boy went into shock and fell, and the water buffalo killed it. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. It sounded pretty far-fetched to us then. But he never cracked a grin when he told that. He was very serious about it. So we have a hard time thinking about the wild ox. I'm sure there were some wild oxen around where Job lived, and he had seen them before. And he recognized the fact that you're never going to break these to the yoke. You're never going to be able to put them in the yoke because God created them to be wild. God created the wild donkey as different from the domestic donkey, and you will never get them to plow your field or anything of that nature. God not only created them, but he feeds them. He made sure that they are in areas where they can get the food that they need. He determines where they will live, and he determines where they will roam. All of these things are things that God does. Now, this next one is really interesting, beginning in verse 13. The wings of the ostrich flap joyfully, but are her feathers and plumage like the stork's? She abandons her eggs on the ground and lets them be warmed in the sand. She forgets that a foot may crush them or that some wild animal may trample them. She treats her young harshly as if they were not her own, with no fear that her labor may have been in vain. For God has deprived her of wisdom. He has not endowed her with understanding. When she proudly spreads her wings, she laughs at the horse and her rider. Well, if you know anything about an ostrich, they cannot fly. They're a bird that cannot fly. They have wings, but they cannot fly. They can flap them all they want to, but they can't fly. But an ostrich can outrun a horse, a racehorse. They can really get going. At the same time, an ostrich is stupid. That's what it says. The ostrich is stupid. She is not a good mom. Once she lays her eggs, she abandons them. And it's the fact that they're in the warm sand, that they're incubated actually, and some of them survive. Some of them are devoured by other wild animals that come around. Would you like to know from God why he made a stupid bird? That would be interesting. He doesn't tell us why he made a stupid bird, but he did. And he's saying to Job, you can't understand this. It's a God thing. I made them because I wanted to, and I sustain them. And even though she's not a good mama and doesn't take care of her young, I take care of them. And I make sure that a certain number of them survive, and not only survive, but thrive. And the thing that we need to recognize about God when we look at the things that are going on around us is that God is not asleep on the job. All of the things that you and I are experiencing today in our world today, God knew about before time began. And He has a plan for all of this. Well, he finally gets around to something that Job can probably identify with. He says, do you give strength to the horse? Do you adorn his neck with a mane? Do you make him leap like a locust? His proud snorting fills one with terror. He paws in the valley and rejoices in his strength. He charges into battle. He laughs at fear, since he is afraid of nothing. He does not run from the sword. A quiver rattles at his side, along with a flashing spear and a javelin. He charges ahead with trembling rage. He cannot stand still at the trumpet sound. When the trumpet blasts, he snorts defiantly. He smells the battle from a distance. He hears the officer's shouts and the battle cry. He's talking about the war horse. He's not talking about the domestic horse that is in somebody's pasture or something like that. He's talking about the war horse. And God is speaking directly to Job about these things. He's talking about the war horse is strong and fearless and swift, and they don't get afraid when they hear all the racket. Now, the domestic horse, a bunch of racket scares them, right? The war horse, no. The war horse will actually run toward the clamor instead of away from it. And God says, I created them for this. I made them this way. And they have fulfilled their purpose. All of these things that we've read, he goes ahead then and talks about the hawk. Does the hawk take flight by your understanding and spread its wings to the south? Does the eagle soar at your command and make its nest on high? It lives on a cliff where it spends the night. Its stronghold is on a rocky crag. From there it searches for prey. Its eyes penetrate the distance. Its brood gulps down blood, and where the slain are, it is there. They're scavengers, in other words. And we have all kinds of scavengers around here. You go down the road, and if there's some roadkill on there are going to be some of those scavengers out there. And the interesting thing, they will wait until the last minute when you're approaching in your car to run away. And almost before you get past, they're running back. They're back there, and they do a good job. They clean up the roads, don't they? It is a little gross. That is absolutely right. But the interesting thing that I want you to get here in chapter 40, verses 1 and 2. The Lord answered Job, will the one who contends with the Almighty correct him? Let him who argues with God give an answer. We're going to stop right there, but I want to bring some things close to hand here. In the first 37 chapters, Job talked about God. Never once did he talk to God. Talked about God. Talked about God to his friends. Talked about God to whomever would listen. But he never spoke to God. When God began to speak, he spoke to Job. He spoke directly to him. And he presented the fact that he is the creator. He is very close to everything he created. He didn't just create them and let them go. He created them. He organized their lives, if you will, and set them in a place where they could thrive. And he continues asking all of these questions to bring across the idea to Job that, hey, I am large and in charge. And don't you forget it. And the fact, by the way, I was thinking of this as I was going through preparing this week. Every once in a while you'll have all of the people, supposedly scientists, who will come out and say, well, such and such a species is almost extinct or is extinct. I'm betting not. I'm betting that somewhere there's a family of them. We just haven't found out where they are. They found some. Exactly. And when I think about what God was saying to Job, I'm thinking God's taking care of him. And he's put him in a place where we maybe can't kill him off anymore. And one of the interesting things that I get from watching mountain men and some of these things is, wolves for a while were protected. Now wolves are overrunning parts of the Midwest and places like that, so that they are giving out licenses now for people to trap and to kill wolves. Same thing with coyotes. At one time they were a protected species, and now they're saying that the Florida panther is actually a member of the puma family, and if so, they're not nearly going into extinction, as the scientists have been saying for the last several years. God keeps everything operating the way he intended. And we need never to forget that. What happened when God was asking Job these 77 questions, every question peeled away a layer of Job's defense. A number of years ago, I read a book that had a chapter in it that talked about reevaluation counseling. And it was the most interesting thing that I'd ever come across. And I tried it a few times. I was working with students at the time, and I tried it with students, and it worked. And I remember using this as an example. I was in Russia. I was teaching youth leaders, and so I was teaching them this idea of reevaluation counseling. And I asked, as I had done before in other things, I asked if there was anybody in the group who had a problem that they wanted to solve and would be willing to come and be kind of a guinea pig for this reevaluation counseling. And so I had a lady who came. Of course, we were having to correspond through or talk back and forth through an interpreter. And my interpreter was a young girl from Ukraine. And so she was doing the interpreting. Well, here's the way reevaluation counseling goes. You tell the person up front, I want you to state your problem. Tell me what your problem is and state it. And so then they would state the problem. And then you would say, I'm going to ask you 3 questions. I'm going to ask each question 3 times. And each time you have to answer me honestly but differently. You can't give me the same answer twice. Well, what happens when you begin to do that is they give you an answer at first, which would be the first answer that comes to mind. And then the second time you ask it, they have to, I can't say that again, and by the time you get to the third one, they've gotten down to the nitty-gritty of the thing, and they've really had to think it through. What is the real crux of this problem? And then you say, would you like to solve your problem? And they say yes. And you say, okay, when will you do it? No, what do you need to do? And you get them to tell you what they need to do to solve the problem. And then, when will you do it? Nail down a time. And then, will you tell me when you've done it? Well, as I began to take this lady through this process, her problem had to do with a family member. She began to weep. And my interpreter said, she's crying. I said, I know. And so I went ahead, and she said, but she's crying. And I said, I know, I understand. But she didn't understand that what we were doing is we're peeling off the layers. Because all of us have a pretty ready answer to anything that we think God might ask us. But if he keeps peppering us 77 times, and by the way, notice 77, perfect number, twice. When he keeps doing that, he keeps peeling off the layers, and eventually we get to the point where we have to say, I don't know. I don't have a clue. I really don't know. So what does this really mean to us? In order for Job to really know God, he had to have a personal relationship with God, which up to that time he did not have. Now let's go back to the beginning of the thing. Job was a righteous man, which meant what? Yeah, he followed God's law. He did things in a right way. What did Job do when he thought, well, maybe my kids have sinned and done something wrong. Yeah, he made sacrifices for them. Didn't talk to God about them, made sacrifices for them. Job really did not have a personal relationship with God. He had a law-based relationship with God, which is pretty much what most of the people in the Old Testament had, you know. Fulfill the law and you're going to be okay. But they weren't hearing from God. They didn't know God. A relationship involves who God is and what God does and what he has done and what that means to me. That's a personal relationship. Now, how do we apply this to us? Well, God not only created the wildlife, but he put within them all of the instinct that guides them and provides for their well-being. And it's unlimited in his power as to what he can equip them to do and get them to do, and how he can get them to respond. Such a God deserves and demands our awe, our worship, and our obedience. Now, one of the things that interests me, and we didn't have any problem with that tonight, but on any given Sunday morning, there are some people that never crack a hymn book, never sing a note. Guess what we're going to be doing in heaven? Praising God, singing. You don't practice now, you're not going to be very good then. You don't become a diva singing arias just because you die, okay? And we will never grow in our relationship with God by our church attendance, by our giving, or by our talking about him. We will grow when we have an intimate relationship with him through reading his word and through worshiping him. There was a U.S. missionary a number of years ago who was in India and had a flourishing ministry and had never been bothered by anybody in the area until one day when he was out and about. He was just arrested, bang, and he was thrown into jail. And there were about 50 other really bad people in that big cell where he was, the big old room. And he was in there day after day after day after day. And he was scared being in there with all these people. And so he prayed and he said, God, I don't know what to do. What shall I do? And the thing that God brought to his mind was sing. He thought, wait a minute now. What do you mean, sing? And he asked him again, God, what do you want me to do? And God said, sing. So he remembered all of the hymns and everything that he had grown up with. He had a grandmother who had an old hymn book, and she had taught him all these hymns. And so he kind of made a mental list of about 10 or 12 of them. And he would think back through them. So he said he got as far away from the group as he could. And he began to sing very quietly. Holy, holy, holy. And he said by the time he got to the 5th song, he had a peace that he had not had before. He said after 2 or 3 days, some of these guys began to say, what are you doing over there? After several weeks and months, men began to come to Christ through his doing what God said, and that is worshiping him. See, when we worship God, he gets loose to do the things that we want to do. What happened with Paul and Silas? They're in jail. They're in stocks. Their arms are in chains. They've got Roman soldiers chained to them on either side. They've been beaten. And so at midnight, what are they doing? They're having a song fest. They are singing. And suddenly, God opens the doors, the chains fall off, and they think there's been a big jailbreak. And the jailer rushes in, and he's about to kill himself. And they said, whoa, 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 we're still here. We're here, you know. Don't hurt yourself. And that's when the Ephesian jailer and his family and all the people that he knew who came to his household were saved and baptized. As a result of that, Psalm 22:3 says, but you are holy, enthroned on the praises of Israel. Some of your translations say, God inhabits the praise of his people. We need to learn to praise God for who he is. And if you don't praise him and worship in your devotional time, it's the reason I tell people a lot of times when they say, what do I need to do to have a quiet time? Well, you need a Bible, you need a hymnal, you need a notebook, and you need a pen. And you need to read the Bible, write down things that God tells you, and you need to worship him by going through some of the hymns. And if you don't sing them out loud, sing them mentally. Go through and worship God. We do. We have extra hymnals in a box underneath up here. So if anybody ever needs one for their quiet time, there's a box right up here. You can just take one. It's all for you. Until we learn to worship God privately, we will not worship him corporately. Without worship, including making a joyful noise, which is what my daddy did. He made a joyful noise. We'll never experience him in his fullness. I want you to watch this video that's going to come up here so that you can see the power of music and worship. Whenever you're ready, Ernie. Okay. Y'all want to do a countdown?
You need to take the method there and go to Congress and get them to get the health care bill straightened out.
There you go. There you go.
Ask these 3 questions. Ask these questions 3 times.
When people are very old and deteriorated and no one enters their world and they're just sitting there, they will withdraw inward more and more. And their desperate need for connection is all now inside. And if a person is all alone, even if they're very, very deteriorated, there's a longing for this kind of closeness. Mrs. Wilson? Hello. You want me to sit? Can you see me good?